Good afternoon. This is Ed Salzberg. I'm the Managing Director of the Security and Sustainability Forum, and I welcome you to our webinar on urban resilience in the era of climate change. I thank Island Press, who's hosting this with us and helped design and recruit the panelists for this session. I'm also grateful that Kaid Benfield, who's the Senior Counsel for Environmental Strategies at Placemakers, and also a senior counsel for the National Resource Development Council, is moderating this session. As you see or you may know already, he has a tremendous background in this area in urban resilience. Before I move into the organization of the session, I want to call your attention to other webinars that we have coming up, and you can go up to the Security and Sustainability Forum website, ssfonline.org or securityandsustainabilityforum.org to register for these sessions as well. Kaid's book is out, People Habitat, 25 Ways to Think About Greener, Healthier Cities, and I recommend you take a look at this book. You're going to get a lot of insights on the ground ways to incorporate resilience into city planning and city programs. Island Press is offering a 20% discount if you use the 4SSF discount code. If you go up to the islandpress.org site, they are very gracious in offering a discount on that book. So I just encourage you to take a look. I think you'll get a lot out of his work. I'm going to introduce Kaid. This is how this is going to work. Kaid's going to introduce the panelists. He's going to make some opening comments to provide some context to the session, and then we're going to roll into panelist briefings. We have a few panel discussion questions that Kaid's put together to be a little provocative, maybe get an argument from this panel. And then we'll move into audience questions. The panelists will make some summary comments right at the end, each taking about a minute or so. And you can add your questions in the GoToWebinar window, about 2/3 of the way down that window. And also, we've uploaded the PDF to the handout section of that same window, so you can download those right now. And I ask that you please take the brief exit survey that helps us improve the quality of these sessions. Kaid earned his stripes at NRDC. He was there for 30 years and really covered the bases there. He's an attorney and provided a lot of regulatory support and assessments of programs there, and I think in a lot of ways helped put NRDC on the map. Right now, he's a senior counsel for environmental strategies at Placemakers. This is a really unusual group that combines urban planning with resilience concepts, and they're an on-the-ground organization that really helps cities move into the new era of extreme events and preparing for them. And let's see, he also teaches at George Washington University, and I can go on for quite a while about Kaid, but let me move on to the presentation and turn this over to Kaid to get things started.
Thank you so much, Ed, and welcome everybody. A recent strategy paper from Island Press and the Kresge Foundation defines urban resilience as the capacity of a community to anticipate, plan for, and mitigate the risks while seizing the opportunities associated with environmental and social change. And in that same paper, in the introduction, the Kresge Foundation noted that climate change is both severe and pervasive, with a disproportionate impact on vulnerable people and communities, and that building climate resilience requires that urban leaders rethink the systems that supply their cities energy, transportation, food, water, and housing. That is a tall order, as we all know, but these are very important times. And we are very fortunate to have three great panelists to flesh out these subjects with us today. And our first speaker, I'm going to introduce them one by one as they come up, is Dr. Ann Kinzig. Ann is a senior sustainability scientist and director of research development for the Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability at Arizona State University. Ann studies ecosystem services, interactions between conservation and development, and the resilience of natural resource systems, and she also teaches courses in urban ecology, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. Ann, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Kaid and Ed. I've been asked to provide a quick overview of 40 years, a little over 40 years of resilience thinking, and as it might apply to cities. So I just want to give a conceptual framework, the way that ecologists and increasingly social scientists have been thinking about resilience. I do not seem to have control.
You should have it, so give it a click or two and you should, there you go.
There we go, hold on. Okay. I think resilience in cities captured the national imagination with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, where we started to realize that we didn't just need to think about the everyday or present-day functioning of systems, but how vulnerable they were to a wide range of potential catastrophes. I also want to make sure before we start off that we're distinguishing between sustainability and resilience. Emphasize that sustainability is a normative concept. It has something to do with desirable futures or desirable states. And while we might agree on some aspects of those, the notion of desirability really does depend on our values and preferences. Resilience, in theory, is a much more objective measure. It's simply a measure of how far, I'm going to use the sort of common day usage of resilience here, how far can you push something before it breaks or fundamentally changes character. And again, in theory, two people should be able to look at something and measure the resilience and come to some agreement on it. It isn't good or bad. In fact, undesirable states can have high resilience. So it's a much more objective measure of a system. And here we're focused on resilience and not as much on sustainability, though of course we'd like to make our sustainable systems resilient. There's also a couple of different kinds of resilience. We could take a city or an ecosystem or a household and make it resilient to one specific threat, in this case a flood. But in doing so, we might have high resilience to a particular crisis or event, but low resilience to other things. There's only so many resources I have to invest in resilience, and if I really protect myself against floods, I might leave myself vulnerable to other things. There's another concept of resilience that's called general resilience. In that, you're facing an uncertain future. Any number of catastrophes might come your way, floods, riots, recessions, disease outbreaks, and you need to invest in resilience in a really different way there. You want to increase your general capacity to adapt and be flexible. And there you might have some resilience over a broader range of crises or events, though you'll never have as much resilience as if you invested in only one threat. So we always have to ask ourselves when we're talking about resilience, the resilience of what to what? What are we trying to protect? And what do we think threatens what we're trying to protect? So the first take-home message is, first of all, that resilience is not a binary state. It's not something that you either have or don't have. There are degrees of resilience, and it's difficult to be resilient against everything. Being highly resilient to one threat may reduce resilience to other threats. This is important to think about with respect to climate change. It is important to invest in resilience against climate change, and yet over-investing it may leave us vulnerable to many other threats that urban areas are facing. Now, there are two different ideas of resilience. One is called engineering resilience, and this really is just the capacity to resist a threat or a perturbation or a disturbance. And in engineering resilience, there really is only a single functional state. The quintessential example of this is the rubber band, right? I can have a rubber band, I can stretch the rubber band, and then the rubber band can either return to its original form or it can break. A broken rubber band is not very functional. So there's a single functional state, a working rubber band. And if I want that rubber band to work all the time, I need to invest in some sort of strength of the rubber band. If we think about a bridge, we might want to invest in rigidity. A bridge is either functioning or it's not. It's either bridging something or it's fallen down. Back in the 1970s, Buzz Holling came along with a really different idea of resilience. He observed that a lot of ecosystems seem to have more than one functional state. There was no guarantee it would return to its original state after being disturbed. Instead, it might morph into something else. A forest might become a grassland, but that would still be a functional state. And this version of resilience, and I don't have time to get into all of the whys of this, says that resilience can be achieved by having adaptability, flexibility, diversity, and something called self-organization, these bottom-up processes that allow ecosystems, communities, neighborhoods to self-organize. It's hard to overstate, because today we're used to the idea of multiple stable states or multiple functional states, the revolution that this created in ecology and in other disciplines. I mean, in the 1960s, our version of ecosystems was the one on the top, engineering resilience. A forest burned and it recovered. We got the same forest back. And Buzz made us understand that a forest burned and we weren't sure what we were going to get back. We might get the same forest, we might get a really different forest, we might get a grassland. The challenge in cities is that both versions of resilience matter. The resilience literature really has overemphasized ecological resilience. And yes, that's important in cases involving anything that's living. But engineering resilience for infrastructure, for buildings, for water delivery systems is also going to matter in cities. Not that you can't design some green elements into these things, but you're going to need some bits of both engineering and ecological resilience. And so we've overemphasized flexibility, diversity, bottom-up processes. And the challenge in cities is in fact incorporating both flexibility and rigidity, diversity and conformity, bottom-up and top-down processes. Now, many of you may have seen this. It's called an adaptive cycle. It's at the core of the resilience theory that Buzz Holling and others have developed. It's really just a birth, life, death cycle. And it's not just that individuals can be born, live, and die, but neighborhoods, businesses, cities, ecosystems, forests, lakes. But in this version, we might start with an immature forest, and this front part of the loop, the green part, is where it grows and it becomes a mature forest. Then a fire might come along and destroy it. This is the back loop or creative destruction of this adaptive cycle. And what we might get back, as Buzz pointed out and others, is the original forest or a fundamentally different forest. As I've already said, it's not just ecosystems or living things, ecological things that go through this. Businesses can go through this cycle. Cities or neighborhoods can go through this cycle. And we might either reestablish the same adaptive cycle, start over where we began to begin with, or we might exit. We might have this exit loop to a different forest, a company that sells phones instead of TVs, a fundamentally different looking city. And one of the questions in resilience is, can we control or know which state we will get? Now, it's not always bad to get something new. We might want to transform a city. We might want to transform a company. But can we know or control which of those states we're likely to get? So behind this is the notion of panarchy, the notion that these adaptive cycles are playing out on multiple scales. I've put below each of these little figure eights what we would see in a forest, and above what we would see in a city. But we have trees going to stands, going to patches, going to forests, going to entire landscapes. If we have a lot of heterogeneity among the trees, if different trees are of different ages, then when a fire breaks out, it can't spread. It breaks out on one that has a heavy fuel load, doesn't spread to the neighbors. That tree might die. But what happens is the forest and then the patch create some sort of memory. They create the seeds that populate that newly created space, and we get much the same tree we had before, because the surrounding trees are all contributing the seeds. If instead what we have are neighboring trees all being susceptible to fire at the same time, stands of all the same age trees, all just waiting to go up, then when a fire hits, it spreads, all the trees disappear, that spreads to the patch, which disappears, and that spreads to the forest, which disappears. So it's when we get this synchrony, this susceptibility to catastrophe being shared across the small scales, that we see catastrophe and disturbance spread to the larger scales. And the way that this is portrayed in the resilience literature is this remember revolt cycle. The larger scales help the smaller scales remember what they were supposed to be. what kind of forest they were supposed to be, what kind of neighborhood they were supposed to be. The revolt cycles happen when at the smaller scales, lots of things are in synchrony. They're ready to be engulfed in flames all at the same time, and they create catastrophe at the larger scales. The final take-home message then is that change is an essential part of resilience. Just because there is change does not mean we've lost resilience. If the functions that we care about remain, we can transform systems and still call them resilient. And change at small scales can actually be critically important. It can be the source of innovation, of newness, of resetting the system that keeps the larger system from becoming too brittle, too connected, or too vulnerable. That's all I have for now. I look forward to questions and discussion.
Thanks, Anne. I think that gives us a great foundation on the concept of resilience, and we're going to go in progress from the general to the more specific. Our next speaker is Jason Vogel. Dr. Vogel is a managing analyst at Abt Associates. Abt is a global company working to improve the quality of life and economic well-being of people worldwide. Based in Boulder, Colorado, Jason has worked extensively on climate change adaptation issues and has just completed a study of climate adaptation efforts in cities across the United States. Jason, it's yours.
Thank you, Ed, or Kaid. I want to talk to you all today, just briefly here about this project that we've engaged in. It was funded by the Kresge Foundation. It was really intended to do the objective was to advance the field of climate adaptation and to catalyze community-based adaptation action. It's been about a 2-year project. I'd like to correct a quick mistake there. It's not completed yet. It should be completed in December. But we've done an awful lot of work over these 2 years. I can only cover a small amount of that work in an approximately 10 or 12-minute presentation. But just to give you a sense of the scope, we had about 15 staff working on this project, approximately 15 external experts that were participating to provide input and feedback and keep us on track. And we learned an awful lot over that period of time. So I'm just going to touch on a few of the things that I think might be interesting. There's almost 250 of you on the phone now, so I'm going to briefly touch on different elements of the project. But one of the big keys to keep in mind is that there's an awful lot going on in climate adaptation, and that's what we're going to try and dig into a little bit here. There are things happening in liberal communities. There are things happening in conservative communities. There are things happening in communities that are rich and have a lot of resources to put into a climate adaptation initiative, but there's also things happening in poor communities that we did not anticipate when we started this project. So that's sort of the take-home I wanted to leave with you at first before I get into this. So the project purpose that I mentioned, it was really to advance the field of climate adaptation, so both to look big picture at the field itself, but also to dig in and see could we provide insights to people on the ground working in communities to try and make their communities a more resilient place. What we found, though, was that in practice, the word resilience was being used in a lot of these communities that we were considering doing case studies on, but they meant very different things when they were talking about that word. So at the risk of sort of undermining the entire premise of our discussion today, for purposes of our project, we sort of jettisoned the term resilience and focused more narrowly on climate adaptation. And we defined climate adaptation to include the responses of these communities to climate variability, to extreme events, and to climate change. And I'll just briefly touch on a couple of assumptions. It took us a lot of time to sort of delimit the boundaries of this study in a way that made sense and was consistent and would help us move the field forward. And a couple of those things, first was to focus at the community level. There's a lot of levels at which action occurs that can address vulnerability to climate risk. For example, state laws or federal regulations, even market action or household decisions. All of these things can facilitate or impede climate adaptation. But we really felt that looking at the community level would provide us with a broad diversity of different types of experiences in different political climates with different sizes of communities addressing different types of vulnerabilities, and to try and really illuminate that rich diversity, and to really ground ourselves in that real life experience. And then, we had to make this sort of explicit attempt to define climate adaptation to include climate vulnerability, variability, extreme events, and climate change, which we also did very consciously because if you just think about climate change, you miss a lot of really interesting things that are going on out there. It's also very difficult to attribute like a hurricane that occurs, is it occurring because of climate change? Is it a little stronger? Is it Category 5 instead of a Category 4 because of climate change? You get into some really sticky issues there, and we felt like we didn't need to address those issues to look at what communities were doing, that we would have sort of this Big Tent approach. And then that last bullet there, reducing vulnerability to climate risks, we really tried to set that out, sort of make that the bar that we judged people's or communities' actions by. Were they tangibly reducing vulnerability to either one climate risk or perhaps multiple climate risks? As I mentioned, this was a long project. We did a lot of things. We did some literature review. We interviewed about 50 thought leaders in a variety of disciplines related to climate adaptation, but not people who just self-describe as adaptation practitioners. And then we conducted 17 case studies that were, at some level of detail in order to produce some analytical findings across those cases and some conclusions, which I'll touch on in the next few slides. But in selecting these cases, we really wanted to look at a diverse set of communities, and diversity along a number of angles. So just to point out a few, if you're in Seattle, Washington, the political dynamics almost require you to talk about climate change if you're an elected official. It's a very environmentally aware community, a very liberal community that wants to tackle the issue of climate change. Tulsa, Oklahoma, on the other hand, not so much. Climate change is almost taboo. It's not something that's discussed explicitly, and in fact, former mayor of Tulsa, Oklahoma is now Senator James Inhofe, so that gives you some sense of the politics of that community. Looking though here at Avalon and Norfolk, here's another dimension. These are both coastal communities facing similar sorts of risks from storm surge and sea level rise, but Avalon has been addressing those risks for almost 60 years, whereas Norfolk has really only more recently started addressing those risks. So we wanted to look at that time dimension. Does it make a difference how long you've been at it? Looking at Cleveland versus Miami-Dade, Cleveland is a community that has faced significant economic decline sort of in the post-manufacturing era of the U.S. that has a very high poverty rate. Miami-Dade County, county-wide, has a lot of diversity socioeconomically, but they've got a pretty solid tax base, some very high-value properties that provide them with the resources to explore some of these issues of climate change. And then just another example of another dimension of diversity here, looking at Flagstaff, Arizona, just the biophysical context. You're inland, Intermountain West, forested ecosystem. What kind of vulnerabilities did they face? What kind of adaptation actions were they taking versus a community like Mobile County, which is coastal in a much wetter environment that has to deal with hurricanes. Oops, I went fast there. I just wanted to put up an example of these profiled actions because it's misleading to suggest that we examined the community as a whole. We really wanted to zero in on a specific policy action that they took or some sort of initiative that was meant to address the vulnerability to climate impacts. And so here's a few examples. I'm not going to read through them all, but I'll just show you that like those first three are really sort of what might be classically called reactive adaptation, communities that experienced an extreme event or were aware of some sort of vulnerability and then did something like El Paso, building a desalinization plant to address their risk of drought. The later three examples are communities that were classically considered proactive communities. They actually were thinking about climate change when they started to do something, but they didn't just do a plan. they actually implemented something on the ground and have, you know, at least started to make tangible reductions to climate vulnerability. So I'm going to give you a sense of what our case studies look like. For all 17 of these cases, we've gone in depth and really looked at how they got there. All these cases and the full report itself will be available sometime in December. If you are interested in receiving it, my email address will pop up at the end of this. Shoot me an email. I'll make sure you get a copy. One case study here, Tulsa, Oklahoma, was subjected to periodic flooding over a long period of time, so much so that it was starting to degrade the infrastructure of the community and its economic base. And they started this program to acquire repeatedly flooded properties. But they were, you know, in the case study, we dive down and we try and look at what are the essential elements, what were the key factors that got this community from just, you know, suffering from flooding to successfully addressing it. And one, in this case, was the history of flooding itself. It was repeated flooding, but then a couple of really extreme events in 1974 and 1976. There were some extreme flooding events in Tulsa that really got the public engaged about the issue. And then right as things started to stall out, there was another flooding event in 1984 on Memorial Day that added renewed vigor to those efforts. So those windows of opportunity that opened due to flooding were a really significant part of the Tulsa story. But so was the community mobilization. This wasn't something that an elected official decided to do. It was a grassroots effort of citizens banding together, meeting in flooded living rooms to create, you know, it wasn't even a nonprofit organization. It was just a group of citizens that were lobbying government to really make significant changes in an environment that's very pro-development. And then, you know, a couple of other issues here that I'm not going to go into just for lack of time. Another quick example here, Chula Vista is one of those communities that developed a broad climate change program, but then drilled down and actually developed specific policies, a cool roof ordinance and a shade trees policy to address the impacts of urban heat. And again, we dig in to find what are those essential elements. And again, you see, even with this forward-thinking community dealing with climate change, this history of climate hazards, a report that was developed by the San Diego Foundation, this Focus 2050 report, really raised awareness, provided digestible information that really helped the decision makers understand what the impacts of climate change might be for them. And there's more, but just in the interest of just barely touching on what some of our findings are, I'll quickly point out we tried to organize our findings according to 4 questions. I won't go through them all, but the first one here is, what are communities doing to adapt? The second, what is driving action in communities? The third and the fourth here, what strategies are being used to achieve change, and what are U.S. communities actually achieving? So I won't be able to go through everything. We have 20 pages of findings of things that we think would actually help people on the ground in communities to sort of take that next step, to answer this question, what are communities doing? If you're at that stage in your community, this section of our findings can help. And we saw things like, under this reducing exposure category, communities completely eliminating risk entirely through land use regulations by preventing beachfront development, or the Tulsa example where you actually are buying out properties that are vulnerable and turning them into public spaces that can be periodically flooded without impact. And just due to lack of time, I'm going to keep moving forward here. For question number 2, what is driving action in these communities? You've got these dashed categories. There's a lot of stuff, but we saw extreme events motivating communities across almost all 17 of our cases. But something that we saw that was really interesting were these shared community values that played a really significant role, where you had things like an identification with natural resources. Flagstaff, Arizona sees itself, and the Southwest Crown of Montana see themselves as forest communities. They value the forest and the context in which they live. And that was something that motivated the community to act. But you also have communities that were dealing with community revitalization and social equity issues like Oakland or Cleveland. And a big part of their motivation was this value of their community to try and sort of pull themselves up by their bootstraps to address some of those social inequity issues and to use the issue of climate change as one way to try and achieve those ends. So we see this diversity of motivations. Quickly here on questions 3 and 4, here, for what strategies are being used to achieve change, I'll just stick with the first one here on effective leadership. One of those findings is that sometimes you really need leadership over a very long period of time. You know, it's not enough to have somebody step up and spend 1 year trying to achieve something. In some of our cases, there were individuals or groups or organizations that spent a decade or 2 decades pushing an agenda before you saw a really successful outcome. On this fourth question, what are U.S. communities achieving? I like this one a lot because we actually saw a lot of actual tangible reductions in climate vulnerability. And that's pretty interesting stuff, but an example would be, with El Paso and their development of a desal facility, there was the recent drought in Texas where the desal facility was run, normally runs at like 10% of capacity. They ran it to full capacity, and they didn't have to engage in any water restrictions. That's a real evidence that they've reduced their vulnerability to drought. And then finally, just to touch on conclusions, as I mentioned, this is a study still in progress. I was actually writing and revising conclusions into the late hours of last night. So this slide is actually different now, but we've tried to divide the conclusions into 2 major categories. One are these strategic considerations for adaptation champions, things that are actual recommendations we would make to people on the ground trying to implement adaptation initiatives in their communities. An example might be this just get started conclusion, which is, there's a lot of current climate vulnerabilities that you can address now that are a first step on the road to addressing climate change. And sometimes we see that it takes decades to see significant vulnerability reduction. And our case studies of Avalon and Tulsa show a multi-decade process. So just getting started is a piece of advice that we would put up there as a conclusion. The second category here now is different, and it's suggestions for advancing the state of the practice of climate adaptation. So we're really looking big picture. For those of you that are thinkers in the field of climate adaptation, what should we be thinking about? Where should we focus our attention? And so an example here of a finding or of a conclusion is that sometimes action comes first. There's a long history in the field of climate adaptation of thinking about planning coming first, about vulnerability assessments, about all that front-end intelligence gathering work. But that's not really what we saw across these 17 communities. We saw necessity as the mother of invention. In the aftermath of an extreme event or when a window of opportunity arose, people in communities took action to get things done. Sometimes they took action without quite knowing where they were going, and they had to bring planning along with them to make sure that action kept moving in a positive direction. But this suggests that adaptation thinkers might want to broaden their focus of attention and not just look at things that are called climate change adaptation plans, but look in other places for things that may actually reduce climate vulnerability or even vulnerability to climate change. With that, I'm over time, so there's the email address to let me know if you'd like a copy of the study when it comes out in December, and I'll make sure you have it.
Thank you, Jason, and note that the email address is jvogel@stratusconsulting.com. I think we saw in Ann's presentation an overall concept of resilience. In Jason's, we saw some examples of specific communities taking specific actions. And in our last presentation, we're going to take that a step further into in some depth. I am delighted to call Mitchell Silver a friend. Mitch is Commissioner of Parks and Recreation for New York City, where he oversees management, planning, and operations of nearly 30,000 acres, some of the nation's most prominent parks, playgrounds, beaches, marinas, rec centers, wilderness areas, and other assets. Prior to his current position, Mitch Silver's distinguished career included serving as president of the American Planning Association and as planning director for the city of Raleigh, North Carolina. Mitch, it's yours.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I don't know if we planned it this way, but today happens to be the 3rd anniversary of Superstorm Sandy, and so we're traveling all over the city just to see how well we are doing. What I can say is New York is now better prepared today than it was 3 years ago, And it was really the intervention over 2 administrations that really is taking climate change and sea level rise very seriously. So while I only joined the administration 18 months ago, I'll share with you how New York City Parks is more resilient as we address the reality of climate change. It is no surprise to many, but New York City is a coastal city. And as a coastal city, New York is at the forefront of climate change. We take sea level rise very seriously. The predictions are daunting. We expect a 1 to 2 foot rise by 2050 and 2 to 4 feet by 2100. And New York City's parks and public spaces are often our first line of defense against severe storms, not only on our shores and beaches, but deep within the boroughs and the neighborhoods as well. Just to put it in context of what this means by a coastal city, in New York we have close to 520 miles of our city is on the coastline. And when you look at that 520 miles, literally 155 miles of that coastline is within a parkland. You're now looking at a picture of Brooklyn Bridge Park. The one preceding that was Riverside South on the Hudson River. And we're now beginning to understand exactly the threat we face, that as we, in the next slide that you'll see, we have 14 miles of public beaches. So while parks are intended for passive and active recreation, it's becoming apparently clear with the threat of climate change that our parks and coastline are in fact our first line of defense. You're looking at Rockaway Beach, was really the hardest hit community during Superstorm Sandy, and now with some of the interventions we're putting in place in terms of berms, it no longer looks like this, but at least we are beginning to protect our public from the threats of sea level rise and climate change. To put Superstorm Sandy in context, it caused $725 million of damage. It impacted 392 park sites. But for New York, Superstorm Sandy was a wake-up call. We've weathered other storms in the past, but nothing came close to the destruction and devastation of Superstorm Sandy, both to lives and to property. And for the first time, New Yorkers started paying attention to this term flood zone. Now, there were some that lived near the coast that understood it, but with the impact of Sandy, it really reset the way we thought about severe storms. In our region, 2/3 of the most vulnerable population live within a half mile of this flood zone. And while, for those of you that understand planning, zoning was created to protect the public health, safety, and welfare due to building and sanitary conditions, that was really the 19th century. But climate change is now the new public health, safety, and welfare threat of the 21st century and beyond, and we have to begin to change our approaches accordingly. Now, this map illustrates the inundated areas hatched in pink and the evacuation zones that are in taupe. Now, some of you may not know New York City, but looking at the size of the city, you can see exactly the park sites are in the pink color, that how this had impacted many of our New Yorkers, both property and lives. And so this is, again, a wake-up call for New York City about how we had to change how we dealt with this threat of sea level rise and climate change. And so there was a new effort toward resiliency and sustainability, and I'll now begin to share with you what New York City is doing, particularly on the park side, to deal with this new emerging threat. For some reason, we have a presentation that's looping. So just give me 1 second while I catch up. Here we go. Back up for 1. So in terms of the new reality, first, the public now understands that climate change is something they have to deal with. We are taking this threat very seriously. We're now joining with both our federal and local partners. To give you an example, the beach that you saw, the Rockaway Beach, we've now added 4 million cubic yards to really extend the beaches so that we would reduce the climate change, the sea storm surge threat. We're building a whole new Rockaway boardwalk, which was for the most part almost entirely destroyed. You're seeing work going on right now, investing close to $300 million, and there are other reconstruction projects that are planned and underway. Specifically in terms of what my agency is doing, we now have designing and planning for flood zone. I'll show you a slide in a second about every single project that I get a chance to see that we now take into account the flood zone. We're looking at Jamaica Bay. This is an area that's very close to JFK Airport. It's a natural area that did far better than some of the hardened services. So we're looking how we can look at Jamaica Bay as a way to address storm surge. And then there are other projects underway. Rebuild by Design, which got a lot of national attention and international attention. We're trying to harden the edge of Manhattan from Montgomery to Midtown. It's now called the East Coast Resiliency. Prior to that, it was called Big U. But it was a new way in urban environments about how we can protect our edges. And then we came up with something called Know Your Zone. This is from emergency management, and because we knew we had so many vulnerable populations, in a second I'll show you the slide about how we're communicating with the public. So this is a slide that's included in every single park design that I get to see. We have close to 2,000 parks in New York City. We try to, there are about 400 active park designs at this time. So anytime staff now presents me with a design, we look at the flood zone, its relationship, and it starts to change the way we plan for some of these public spaces. For example, if it is within a flood zone, we try to find out if it's freshwater or saltwater. It changes the way we provide our landscapes and materials. We may look for salt-tolerant trees and shrubs. We'll certainly prohibit artificial turf, which does not do well on a storm surge, and even cases of the boardwalk that we're rebuilding. We're now using recycled plastic lumber called RPL instead of tropical hardwood. And for the communities, it can be very difficult because Coney Island, for example, has an iconic wooden boardwalk that dates back to the 19th century. A portion of that was damaged. We're now rebuilding it using recycled plastic. And the community is struggling with the reality of climate change. Is now we're building it with concrete, recycled plastic, but it doesn't have that iconic look as a wooden boardwalk that people remember when they were a child. So these are some of the challenges that we're facing as we start to implement a better, stronger, and more resilient city. I had mentioned the Know Your Zone. This is now available to all of our citizens. We now, based upon your zone, there are 6 of them. When we know a threat is coming, we'd like the public to know what zone there is, and each one of those zones will tell them what they need to do. There's more to this website. You're just seeing one screenshot, but this is our way of keeping the public better informed. It's a notification system, how to be prepared, what to do, but it lets the most vulnerable population become more prepared by understanding where they live, the threats, and how to prepare in the event of the zone. So this is now up and running. It was just tested recently with the threat of Hurricane Joaquin on its way. Luckily, we did not have to activate it, but a lot of people paid attention, and they felt a lot better prepared about the impending threat. Also, we understand, as Kaid said, that we have of agencies, we run our systems, whether it's park system, whether it's a highway system, whether it's a sewer system, all of our systems are interconnected and interrelated. And so as a result, aside from our new partnerships with the Army Corps and state agencies, all the agencies have developed now a stronger relationship under the direction of a newly created Mayor's Office for Recovery and Resiliency. And I encourage you, if you want to find out more about this office, Dan Zarilli is the director of that office, and if anybody wants to find out more about what we're doing, I would encourage you to call Dan. He pulls all the agencies together to make sure we're all reaching the same resiliency results. Just very quickly, these are just some of the examples of this new engagement. We're now working with the Department of Environmental Protection. We're looking to expand our green infrastructure. Many of our parks that are now being redesigned are also serving as stormwater retention devices to alleviate some of the flooding that's happening in some of the key areas. And this is now becoming a common practice that did not happen as much before, even though we were doing this work for a decade. Now there's even a greater emphasis because of climate change threats that we're addressing all these green infrastructure techniques in some of the priority flood zone areas. And then what is refreshing under this mayor, just earlier this year, we released a plan called One NYC. It builds on the vision of the previous administration called Plan NYC, but one of the 4 visions of One NYC is called the Resilient City. And there are 4 components, but I'll only focus on the coastal defense due to time. Prior to 2013, believe it or not, the city had never adopted a comprehensive coastal protection plan to reduce risk of flooding and sea level rise. But the release of a report called A Stronger, More Resilient New York, the city now has a comprehensive coastal plan in place that has already taken the steps to implement its first phase, which includes $3.7 billion program of infrastructure investments, natural area restorations, and design and governance upgrade. So that is already in place. Some of the resilient, when I say initiatives over the next 10 years, we're going to have an integrated flood protection system on the east side of Manhattan, which I had spoke about earlier, an armored levee of stormwater management on the east shore of Staten Island in partnership with the Army Corps, investments on the Rockaway Peninsula, which you saw a picture of, and as well as Jamaica Bay. And then there are nature-based measures in Jamaica Bay that we're trying to put in place so we can see how our natural environment can also protect us. If you want to find out more about this report, you can go to nyc.gov/1NYC. Now, this next slide may be difficult to see, but this is just showing you the investment New York City is making to keep our public and our property safer. These are projects that are either planned, studied, or under construction throughout all the 5 boroughs. You can also get a copy of this map in the 1NYC report, but this is how serious we're now taking the threat of sea level rise and climate change in our city, that we're investing millions of dollars to ensure that these projects move forward. And then finally, when we talk about lessons learned, I didn't discuss this in my presentation, but it's something that became quite apparent now that I'm Parks Commissioner, is how important it is to document existing conditions of your assets. The FEMA reimbursement process is a long process, and I can tell you, because we did not do the proper documentation to be able to build it back quicker, that it really delayed the entire process of building back what we had lost during the storm. So we now are doing that throughout all of our assets. The reimbursement process takes a long time. That is now, in the future, should this happen, will help to expedite it. Another lessons learned is managing public expectations. Beyond explaining to the public that the rebuilding process is taking a long time, and that's a hot topic today as we talk about the 3rd anniversary, we need to be able to explain to the public, should something happen, how long and what do we have to do to make sure that we build it back as quickly as possible, but they understand that it will take some time to get their lives back on track. Also, it's important to explain what resiliency looks like. I shared with you some examples, but I'll go over them again. We're now looking to put a levee on Staten Island. This, for many residents, will now block the view of the ocean. We want to protect the public. They can see the ocean from on top of the new levee boardwalk, but those that are used to seeing the ocean from the land side will lose that view. These are some of the trade-offs they have to understand of what resiliency looks like. I mentioned Coney Island. It's still a very controversial decision, but we decided not to use tropical hardwood, cutting down acres of the rainforest, which contributing to global warming, that we decided to use recycled plastic. People still want that iconic wooden boardwalk, but we are moving forward with the concrete and recycled plastic. There are comfort stations that now are being elevated some 14 feet off the ground in order to address with not just the 100 but the 200-year storm. And there are berms and levees, and this is a new reality that we have to deal with the public. Finally, I would encourage you to start working on the design guidelines in flood zones, other areas of threat and vulnerability, because to me, I believe it is very vital that we start creating those resilient places, and it's very helpful when you have those guidelines that you can walk through and with the public to understand exactly what resiliency looks like. And with that, I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Mitch. Those were great images, by the way, and some of them very sobering and jogging our memory of some of these events, and others are more hopeful. And I think that's the state we're in when we think about resilience to these impacts of climate change. One of the images in your presentation, Ann Kinzig, was of Hurricane Katrina. And I noticed we have a question from the audience that's on a subject I was planning to explore anyway, so I'm going to go right to it. And that's the issue of equity. You know, as we saw all too clearly in the aftermath of Katrina, the impact of disasters tend to fall especially hard on the poor, frequently on communities of color, More of their numbers tend to live in substandard housing. They live in low-lying unprotected areas. They may lack sufficient insurance to rebound. How do we address issues of equity and resilience planning? I would invite all of the speakers to comment on that, and Ann, I would invite you to go first.
Yeah, there's clearly no easy answer to that question, though it's critically important, as you say. This touches on sustainability as well, because there's a thread of conversation in sustainability, as well as in resilience, that suggests that if you just empower local communities, they can create desirable, sustainable, and resilient futures for themselves. And I'm a skeptic on that point, and I'm not opposed to empowerment, particularly for those that are the least empowered. But often what plays out when you empower local communities is precisely that the rich end up, for a variety of reasons, more empowered than the poor. They have more time on their hands quite often, not working 2 jobs to support a family. They have more resources. They have more political clout. And oftentimes communities will make decisions that are really good for them and export harm to others. And so I can't emphasize enough that resilience planning, and I think our other 2 speakers also emphasize this, has to happen at the right scale. You have to be taking into account how the decisions that you make and the trade-offs inherent in those decisions will impact others that are less powerful than you, or distant in space, or even distant in time. How does it impact future generations? And if we fail to do that, we won't ultimately have achieved resilience. I think certainly international affairs with refugee crises illustrate that just as well as our own crises in cities with rioting with respect to disenfranchised populations.
Yeah, let me just add, this is Mitchell, that clearly when a storm surge came, it did not discriminate whether you were rich or poor. And so from our point of view, there are those that are well off that if their homes are damaged, they have alternative means until they actually rebuild. The city has some lessons learned. Number one, to know your zone, because people complained the most about communication, not know what to do next, felt totally disenfranchised, and just didn't understand what was going on. Post-hurricane, post-Superstorm Sandy, we now have a better way of communicating. If the event happens, how to get to people locally. We now recognize, if you look at the map of where we're intervening, to ensure that we're better prepared for future storms. We want to make sure it was equitable, because again, as you saw the number, a significant portion of our population lives near flood zones, that the Rockaway, the one that got hit the hardest, happened to be a community that a lot of public housing was built, and a lot of poor people, decades ago were pushed out there, and they were the hardest hit. So we have focused and concentrated our efforts. Right now, probably the biggest investment project underway happens to be in the Rockaway, where, as I mentioned, we're extending the beach, we're putting in berm, we're putting in a hardened boardwalk that's concrete, and so we're communicating loud and clear that all the residents of the city matter, but we want to make sure those are the most vulnerable, that we have the protection in place to not make them that vulnerable. I can even go on about some of the businesses and what happened, but I agree with you. I think it's in the response. It's what's happening during and right after the event, but also to say loud and clear that we will not just rebuild in areas that are more affluent, that we're going to focus on those that are most vulnerable, and that's the approach that New York City is taking.
Jason, would you like to weigh in?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a particular focus of the Kresge Foundation now. They've really zeroed in on this issue of differential vulnerability to climate change, and how do you tackle that, particularly in urban areas. So we ended up, some of our case studies I think are good examples to see what people have actually done on the ground to try and bring issues of social justice and economic disparity into conversations about climate adaptation. And I would point out 3 cases in particular. One is Oakland, California, where the Oakland Climate Action Coalition formed. It's a group of I think 30 different nonprofit and community organizations, mostly focused on social justice and equity issues, that when they saw the city revisiting their climate action plan, decided to get involved. And once they got involved, they started working with the city's sustainability officer and developed a partnership where they have actually become sort of the focal point for communicating with a broad swath of the community out there. And it's really helped keep Oakland's focus on sort of the most vulnerable people. Cleveland is another example where just because it has so much poverty to begin with, and they were looking for a way to tackle those issues as well, the city partnered with, Cleveland has these community development corporations that are sort of neighborhood by neighborhood organizations trying to revitalize neighborhoods and sustain local businesses, and partnered with those groups who have these connections with people on the ground in very vulnerable communities, and many of the communities that have been neglected, to try and figure out, what is that first step that we need to take. We're not trying to tell you need to worry about 20 or 50 years from now what's going to happen, but what can we do today and do it smartly that achieves your objectives, which might be community revitalization or local economy, but also is doing it in a smart way when you look over that longer time frame. And a third case that's worth looking at is Baltimore, Maryland, where their efforts have also focused particularly on disadvantaged populations. And some of the things they did to encourage participation, they had daycare available at the meetings that they asked people to come to. They would pay people a small amount of money, but some money, and provide transportation to get them to the meeting space. So they recognized that a lot of the folks who couldn't normally participate were missing voices, and found ways to, with a small expenditure of city resources, to bring those voices to bear on the Baltimore climate adaptation planning process.
That actually raises, in my mind, a related point, which is the issue of what we might call social capital. In the report that was prepared for Island Press and Kresge, I was struck by one particular finding. Those of us of a certain age may remember that in 1995 there was a devastating heat wave in Chicago that killed 800 people, many of them in low-income communities of color, but there was an exception of a low-income neighborhood that had lower mortality rates. And sociologist Eric Kleinenberg attributed that exception to the degree of social connectedness in that neighborhood, residents checking in on each other, on the elderly and the sick, on the vulnerable. Ann Kinzig, does social capital play a role in resilience?
It absolutely does. It's critically important, but I guess I'd want to emphasize that in any resilience thinking, too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. So let me take both social capital and diversity as examples of that, because on the face of it, we think, great, we have social capital, we have diversity. If you look at the anthropological literature, what we know about human group interactions, a very, very strong in-group identity, lots of social capital, we are a team, often comes as the result of thinking of those outside of your group as others. And so the real challenge is having, again, enough social capital that you have that cohesion in, say, a neighborhood, but not so much that that comes at the expense of that neighborhood being willing to help those outside of the neighborhood. As I was showing, when catastrophes can propagate, you actually want to be able to help across scales and not focus too narrowly. Diversity is another example. You'll also often see in the resilience literature this notion that diversity is a good thing or trust is a good thing. And these are sort of politically correct statements that bother me. Sometimes diversity is a good thing when we really need innovation and have the time to winnow that innovation. And sometimes we just need to act quickly without a lot of diversity. So for instance, if a meteorite were about to strike the planet, I would not want a lot of diversity of ideas for how we should deal with it. I would want the single best idea. I'd want the meteorite to get shot down and move on with things. So it's always a balancing act. We can talk about these things that are good to have, and they are important, and if there's too little of them, we have to invest. But we can also get too much of them.
I think we can agree about that meteorite. Jason or Mitch, do you have thoughts about social capital?
Well, I mentioned that in my first question. Those networks became vital as I was hearing people tell stories, not this year, but on the second anniversary, of the importance of the networks, because there were areas where the first responders hadn't gotten there yet, or people were still stuck in apartments, and people were dying to get updates and information. These informal hubs in the community. Red Hook was one example that became a place where people gathered to get information, to tell stories, and then from there it actually built a strong relationship in that community which still exists today. Now, it did not exist prior to the storm, but afterwards this informal hub really became the place for shared stories, for people to help, to get information, because at that point in time the city had not been able to organize that quickly because the devastation was so broad. They're not the only ones that happened in the Rockaway. So I agree that it is important that it be nurtured beforehand, but in the unfortunate event of an event, that it is a way going forward that people can get that lesson learned and understand the importance of having those hubs, those connections, so that you can do the checking around, you can be better prepared into the future.
Jason?
I'll make this quick. I think the answer is pretty clearly yes, social capital is very important. And some of the cases that we looked at bear that out. But what's interesting is social capital can be something that exists and then you can draw upon it to address your vulnerabilities, or it can be something that you don't have and then it's something you need to develop. And that's one of the things that we saw, particularly in some of the communities that I just mentioned, like Oakland, Cleveland, and Baltimore, where they recognized that they didn't have a lot of that social capital. Cleveland actually called it social cohesiveness, that they were trying through their neighborhood climate action toolkit, I believe is what it was called, that they were trying to generate social cohesiveness, which they believed was a prerequisite to any real sort of tangible vulnerability reduction efforts. And I kind of like thinking of it in that way. That this is all pieces of adaptive capacity, but if you don't have those basic necessary conditions to address climate change or resilience, you may have to address those things first in order to get to that higher level of policy discussion.
I'd like to stay with you, Jason, for the next question. This comes from the audience, and it's another one of those that I had planned to ask anyway. And I will introduce it by giving another Chicago example. And the question goes to what's the right scale at which to address these issues. That's something that Ann mentioned in response to the first question. And I'm particularly thinking about our metropolitan regions where we have such fragmented systems of government with so many municipalities. I had the pleasure of studying Chicago on this matter some years ago, and at the time Chicago comprised some 284 independent municipal governments. Did you find examples of regional cooperation where people were going beyond the municipality to think in regional terms?
Definitely. There were, and this is happening in more places than this, but just amongst the cases that we were looking at, one was Chula Vista, California, which is part of a 4-city collaborative in the San Diego region where, and I don't know San Diego that well, but it includes San Diego and it includes Chula Vista. And for those of you from California, I apologize. I don't know what the other 2 cities are, but you know, they developed this collaborative, this climate collaborative to share ideas and to sort of network and figure out who was doing what successfully and what could be mirrored and where resources were coming from, and also to combine resources in some cases. And that's where the San Diego Foundation published that San Diego, the Focus 2050 report, which was an attempt to provide decision makers across all 4 of those municipalities with information that was relevant to the different needs that emerged in those 4 different communities. And there's a second example. We had Miami-Dade County in Florida, which is part of the 4-county compact region. Again, playing a similar role of convening these different actors across different municipalities to share ideas and to sort of develop a regional agenda. But what I think is really interesting is that in these collaboratives, as far as I can tell, and we didn't study them in great depth, but they came together and it became this great peer-to-peer networking opportunity, a good learning opportunity. But to get anything done, people that were part of the collaborative then had to go back into their stovepipes, if you will, to get things done, to write a policy, to implement, a very specific thing, to change the nature of a park, to better protect a coastal community from storm surge. So it was sort of a coming together, a generation of ideas, this peer-to-peer networking, and then they had to go back apart again to do their jobs and get the work done.
Does anyone else want to speak to that issue? If not, I've got another question.
No, I'll pass on that.
Well, just a quick response. This is Ann, obviously. There's no single rate scale. Obviously, you need to empower local communities to create that social capital, to create their vision of what a desirable future would look like, and then you need to higher scales, governments, to say we're not going to allow you to export too much harm to others, or the taking control of your own destiny compromises some other neighboring community. So you're always trying to build resilience or adaptability at multiple scales, always.
The next question goes to funding, and I'm actually going to combine a couple of questions from the audience on this one. One says, social capital gives me a thrill, but it don't pay my bills. Give me money, that's what I want. And that leads to another question from the audience that was directed at you, Mitch. And how are these projects that you mentioned being funded?
Well, some of them we have gotten a grant from HUD. Some of them are from FEMA to really build them back. But if you're going to build them back differently, FEMA will only restore what was there. If you want to do the extra improvement, it comes from the city. This came from our capital plan. We recognize the amount of billions of dollars from destruction that comes from a storm versus having improved infrastructure. So now this is a 10-year plan. This is not something that's being spent right away. But primarily it's coming from the taxpayers, and some of it's coming from the federal government. But even the private sector, because we have new requirements for buildings that are now being elevated, so they understand the new rules. But this is coming from the taxpayers themselves, that the city, through their capital improvement plan, is where we're investing those dollars. But again, it is from those various sources. We have to do that over a long period of time because we have, of course, other investments we have to make in the city. But if we are rebuilding something and it's in a vulnerable area, we're designing it differently than we would have in the past. I had mentioned parks. A lot of our parks are along the coastline. So as we're building it back, we're doing it differently. It's part of my capital budget. But again, I don't want to reiterate, but it's from the federal, the state, it's coming from the city, but also in some cases also coming from the private sector themselves. But this is something we feel we have to do. The implication of not doing it is not only will harm people's lives, but harm property. And if we don't invest the $3 billion, it could be $20 billion of damage. So we feel it's an investment that's well worth it to protect the public. Now, I understand the city, as large as New York, has different resources than some smaller jurisdictions, but I would always encourage someone to look at their emergency management plan, to look at their capital improvement plan, and there are some interventions you can do, whatever approach a city takes through their bonding mechanism, but this is something, again, you have to explain those threats to the public so they understand it's not just spending money, it's a new way to plan to be more resilient as you go into the future. There are different design techniques that you can take that will protect the public a lot better. So New York clearly is a difficult example for some, I'm sure, on this phone call because of the scale of the city, but it is something that because we have 8.5 million people in our city, we have to figure out a way to protect them, and so we're funding those dollars in order to make them safe.
Yeah, I could speak to that a little, if that's okay. Across the 17 communities we looked at, I think we saw quite a bit of creativity and a lot of different and interesting ways of generating dollars to implement the kinds of climate adaptations that we were looking at. So some of them are obvious. Sometimes it's the feds. And if you can get the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers or FEMA to help you out in a pre or post-disaster situation, that's sort of a common source of funding. But we also saw some really interesting things. Flagstaff, Arizona, in order to fund fire mitigation activities on Forest Service land, it went to a vote of the citizens to issue a $10 million bond to fund that work, which passed with 73% approval. Grand Rapids is another example of a community in Michigan where they tied the issue of reducing vulnerability to storms, which caused a lot of flooding in the urban areas, to the rehabilitation of their transportation infrastructure, and they passed a tax that was, they called it Vital Streets. It was both multimodal transportation improvements, repaving the streets, and developing green infrastructure to reduce stormwater flooding. We also saw, sort of in the O&M side of things, we saw communities like Tulsa, Oklahoma, instituting a utility fee, a small fee on top of your water bill that funds all of the continuing acquisition of properties, as well as funding the maintenance of, they have who knows how many acres now that's become parklands and ball fields and bike paths, and they need to maintain those lands. And they can do so because they generate, if I remember right, they're generating several $1 million a year through this utility fee. And it goes on. There's lots of grant opportunities, some of which come from foundations, some of which are the feds. Where in Mobile County, that was a federal grant that paid for that, coming out of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act to rebuild oyster reefs. In the Southwest Crown, it was I forget the name of the forestry initiative that encourages forest collaboratives. So, dollars are a concern, and you've got to find dollars somewhere. But I think there might be more opportunities to find them than people generally assume.
Here's a question that goes, I think, to Mitch's comments about trade-offs, and potentially it goes to Ann's remarks about being resilient to climate change might make cities more vulnerable to other threats. And we have a comment from Oregon that says, if we change our approach from resilience to climate change, aren't we missing other kinds of hazards, such as hazards from seismic and other geological impacts? And the commenter suggests that we need to fold these all in and look for commonalities and ways to address more than just climate change when we look at resilience. Ann, would you like to tackle that one?
Obviously, I completely agree, since it was one of the points I was making. We can't have too much of a single-minded focus on climate, even though that presents a variety of hazards, right? It's not just flooding, but heat waves and disease outbreaks. Anyone who's seriously interested in resilience of cities has to say, what is the full suite of threats that might face my city in the future, regardless of whether that's originating from anthropogenic climate change or other things. And just in case that's hard to conceptualize, let me just give you one simple example. Let's say a city really seriously invested in public transportation as a way of reducing its CO2 emissions. Very positive thing on the face of it, and I wouldn't disagree, but it makes us more vulnerable to disease outbreaks. We're suddenly all sharing a bus or a train car, or even a car for a carpool, and disease will spread much more rapidly under those conditions. You have to think about those things when you're designing resilience, and I think the commenter is absolutely right. Cities are facing a lot of things, not just climate.
I agree. I mean, the conversation was about urban resilience in the context of climate change, but heat, flood, hazardous material spills. There's a lot of events that cities have to plan for, but in this context, we were just focusing on those threats primarily from climate change. But I actually agree that we need to, there's economic resilience, where a lot of cities are one company industries, and if that industry goes down, it has devastating effect on the economy of that place. So I agree, and certainly all smart places, smart cities, smart towns want to be as prepared for any threat, whether it's economic, social, or environmental. In the context of this conversation, I was just limited about what we were doing when it relates to some of those severe climate change-related threats, and for us, it tends to be the hurricanes or flooding, and being a coastal city, this is something we have to pay attention to, but is not discounting all the other threats and vulnerabilities that our city faces. So the person from Oregon is absolutely on target. I think that would just require another conversation, talk about all those other threats and vulnerabilities that places face.
Jason, I assume that many of the communities that you surveyed would agree with that.
I don't want to speak for those communities. I'll make my own observation, I guess, which is at least the way that we approached the topic was really just about getting things done. How are you going to get things done? And if you can frame resilience as this thing that includes climate resilience and economic resilience and political resilience and the resilience of your transportation system functionality, and get buy-in from the right people and get policies passed and make changes in your community, great. What we saw across our communities was that a lot of communities didn't even get to the point of thinking about climate change in terms of resilience. They were just responding to an extreme event. They were forced to act. And what they did right, I think, was instead of just building back the way it was, they decided to build it back better, or to build it back different in a way that reduced their vulnerability. But they weren't consciously thinking about resilience when they took that action. There were communities that we looked at that were thinking about climate change specifically, and it was a salient issue in their community. It had political support, and it was enough to fund a program or to get something done. And it's narrow, and I think we should be realistic about what they've accomplished. And it does not address economic resilience. If Chula Vista is subjected to significant economic decline, their climate adaptation activities are not going to help them out. And then, I live in Boulder, Colorado, so I know the mayor a little bit, and we're one of the 100 resilient cities. And I saw his feedback from the meeting of the Rockefeller Group, which is all the mayors from that group, which, that definition of resilience is very broad. And it was interesting, in his report back to City Council, what he said was that the conversation at the 100 Resilient Cities meeting of mayors rarely ever talked about climate change at all, which is something we here in Boulder really care about, but it really focused more on economic issues. I mean, there's a lot of developing country cities that are part of that program. They were worried about economic stressors. They were worried about political stressors and political upheaval. They were worried about whether their transportation systems could function given population growth, and that pretty much dominated the conversation amongst the mayors. So I'm not sure I have an answer, but I do like the focus on getting things done.
One of the observations that came in from the audience is that a professional emergency manager with an all hazards perspective is very helpful. And I think that reminds me that Mitch Silver, in your presentation, you referenced the Mayor's Office for Recovery and Resiliency. And I'm wondering if you might expand on that. I know you touched on it in your remarks, but do you know how that office was created and how it functions administratively?
It was created under the previous mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, and it was a response to Superstorm Sandy. And it is basically an overarching office that ensures that all of the key agencies that have a role in recovery and resiliency work together, talk together, and so they're kind of the umbrella organization. For example, right now I mentioned the East River Resiliency Project. We received over $300 million from HUD. That office, although it's parkland and we're the client or the owner of the land, so to speak, it is that office that's working with all the agencies, the one that's going to design it, environmental protection, transportation, parks. They're the organizing element to ensure that resiliency and recovery stay on the forefront. So that office is critically important, and it continues to function today. So I was very pleased the administration saw the value of that organizing role directly from the mayor's office to ensure that we stay on target toward these resiliency efforts. I also want to mention, because I know we did this in our pre-call, But our hazard mitigation plan, when I was in Raleigh, North Carolina, we did not take threats that seriously. As a planner, it was usually held out of the city manager's office, but I inserted myself to play a greater role in the hazard mitigation plan to really start to emphasize more the planning intervention and what we can do versus having a standard plan you submit to the federal government so you're eligible for FEMA reimbursements. That was a key place where we got a lot of planning interventions, where we started to ensure subdivisions had two-way in versus one-way, and some other things we had to do in terms of floodplain. So aside from the New York City example of this very critical overarching office, I would encourage people to look at the hazard mitigation plan. Most planners I know, or planning departments, play a minor role in a hazard mitigation plan, and to me that is a key way to start to underscore some of the threats and at least have a conversation about what to do about them.
I think the potential flip side of wanting to address all hazards, not just climate change, was posed by another one of our commenters, which is, given the urgency of climate, actually let me ask this question in two ways. The first way is the way it was posed by the commenter. Does the resilience and adaptation cluster of responses downplay the necessity of the important steps that we need to take to actually mitigate and reduce the impacts of climate change? And before you answer that, a related point is that according to the latest polling, 76% of Americans believe that climate change is occurring, while only 14% believe that it is not. But sometimes it seems that the minority who do not believe climate change is occurring includes a disproportionate number of political and business leaders. How do we talk about the urgency of these issues without being divisive? Anne? How about
So
Jason?
you're just having trouble finding my unmute button. No, I'm here. I just couldn't find my unmute button. That's a long, long answer. And I don't, a couple of observations. One is that, as I think one or two questioners earlier pointed out, we can actually tuck a lot of things in under climate without ever talking about climate. You could suggest to a city that they need to be resilient towards disease outbreak, towards heavy rainfall, towards heat waves without ever attaching it to anthropogenic climate change. And some of those same investments might make them resilient to other non-environmental threats as well. And that's in fact something we've had to do in Arizona. It's not an area, at least in Phoenix, that's amenable to talking about anthropogenic climate change. The mitigation adaptation question has just been a perennial difficult one. The bottom line is cities can do almost nothing to mitigate against climate change. The efforts that an individual city makes to reduce CO2 emissions will not budge climate change one bit. But they can make significant advances in adaptation. And so in a world of limited resources, they really are going to focus on adaptation because they can benefit from that investment far more directly than they can from being just a speck of the number of cities out there contributing to climate change. And so we've always had that tension, and again, it speaks to having to manage this at multiple levels. At the level of the municipality and even the state, a lot of the focus is quite understandably and rationally going to be on adaptation. At the higher levels, at the level of the nation, we need to be focused on mitigation. There's no easy way around that.
Mitch Silver?
Yeah, I agree with Ann. I agree with Ann's comments. You know, when I was a planning director, we didn't use the word climate change. It was sometimes a difficult word to communicate in the South when I was in North Carolina, but people related to the specific threats. We had flooding. We had hurricanes. We had severe storms. We had heat. And so we talk about the specific events, and I'm going to go back to the hazard mitigation plan again, is that with our comprehensive plan and hazard mitigation plan, we were able to communicate clear threats that we had to plan for. Now, I agree in climate change it's very difficult for one state to solve this problem, but we were able to deal with some specific problems that we could handle through either governance or through direct implementation of capital spending. And so that's how we dealt with it. People understood because of the way we did not have our stormwater system basically used the natural landscape, that we were prone to flooding, and so we looked at ways of rethinking our floodways and our flood zones. So we didn't use the word climate change, although some did, but we focused on the specific threats and hazards and what do we need to do to mitigate them in our environment, knowing full well that those threats, some of which could be related to the change in the climate. So that's how we did it locally, and it's something that was very effective. New York is something entirely different. Because we're a coastal city, we recognize our vulnerability. Here's an environment where people talk about climate change. We're proud of it. The mayor has made in One NYC other announcements about how we have to reduce greenhouse gases by 80% by 2050. So it depends on your environment, how you have that conversation. In the South, we had to nuance it and focus specifically on the threat, vulnerability, or hazard. In New York, it's an environment where we see the threat right before our very eyes. 1 to 2 feet in this city will be devastating. So we, through the office I mentioned, the Mayor's Office of Recovery and Resiliency, are spending a lot of time of looking at the impact of what does 1 or 2 foot rise of the sea mean to our city. And we're preparing that in advance, and the public is on board with us because they've seen the effects of a superstorm, of what it could do. Not a hurricane, that was a superstorm.
Jason, I want to go to you, but I want to go with a different question because I know that we're running short of time. One of the things that popped up from your presentation is that some communities are pursuing what you called co-benefits, I think, where the same measure is providing multiple benefits to the community. Could you give some examples of that?
Yes. So one example, I'll just give a couple really quick here in rapid succession. I mentioned already in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where they sort of hitched the climate adaptation wagon, if you will, trying to deal with stormwater issues. Like one of the least sexy issues in all of public policy is dealing with stormwater. But they linked it to transportation infrastructure improvements, which is right a bread and butter issue, potholes. And by doing so, they were able to achieve the transportation benefits, which, you know, some people in the community would say were more important. Others would say they're less important, but they're, you know, they're both co-benefits of the action that was taken. Another example, though, you know, is the El Paso example, which I also mentioned, where they developed a desalination facility in order to reduce their vulnerability to drought. But they didn't just do it because they were worried about drought. They did it because the U.S. Army base there, Fort Bliss, was under threat from the base realignment and closure. I forget the name of it, but it was under threat to be shut down entirely because the threat of drought meant that the fort could not expand. And so it really became an issue of the economic viability of El Paso as a city and the importance of Fort Bliss there. That became a co-benefit that really helped drive some pretty amazing things, you know, to get a city, you know, I guess it's the county-wide water utility and the U.S. Army to be talking together and allowing cross-jurisdictional use of land and resources is a pretty big bar to set, and they did it. And I could go on with lots of examples, but maybe that's a couple of good ones.
Yeah, I think another example is one that Mitch emphasized in his presentation, which is green infrastructure. I'm a huge fan of green infrastructure, which absorbs stormwater, which provides public health benefits, which reduces urban heat islands, provides recreational benefits, all sorts of things. We're at the end of our time, and what I would like to do now is to invite each of you to give 60-second closing remarks, and let's go in the order in which the presentations were made. Anne, I'll start with you.
There's not much that can be said in 60 seconds, but I guess what I would encourage those of you on the ground thinking about resilience in your own cities to do is to think about how you have to manage that at multiple scales and how different strategies are required at multiple scales. And also about the potential unintended consequences of investments in certain forms of resilience, because if those aren't on the table as you're designing resilience, you'll end up with unpleasant surprises later.
Jason?
There's so much to say and so little time. Maybe it's just sort of a capstone to the conversation we've had today. I mean, it really is centered around the idea of urban resilience. And a concern that I have about the term resilience is its relative vagueness and the fact that it can mean different things to different people. And I suppose I would encourage folks to avoid abstractions to the extent possible and to really focus on getting good work done on the ground. And that may be, that may require talking about resilience, it may require talking about climate change, it may require avoiding talking about climate change. But there's, you can still boil everything down to what we're all really trying to accomplish, which I think is reducing vulnerability. And it can be reducing vulnerability to flooding, if that's what you happen to be focused on. It could be a multi-hazard vulnerability reduction sort of concept, or maybe it's including economics and other things. But there's an actual metric there, something that people can talk about and agree on that they want to do. And if we maintain that focus, then we won't be distracted in these sort of discussions of what terminology means and how we should think about it. And we can just really focus on making our communities a better place to live, work, and play.
I'm a planner, and so I have to go back to an earlier remark that I made. And what impressed me about my profession is that there was always this challenge to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. That's why the profession was created in the first place, because the way we're planning and building or not doing things were killing people. And so that lack of inaction or what we were doing was harmful. That was the 19th and early 20th century. We're now the 21st century. And in my opinion, whether we want to call it climate change or whatever threats we're facing, that same charge has not changed to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. I encourage all of us to use whatever terminology, whatever technique is possible, but ultimately that is our obligation, that there are consequences for taking no action, and that we have to understand that for us to protect the public health, safety, and welfare from the threats of climate change, severe weather, and all the other vulnerabilities is something that we have to step up and do. And so that's something that I take to heart. So when I look at my portfolio in parks, my goal is protect the public health, safety, and welfare, and we will figure out the best way we can do that. But that is the point that I want to leave people with, and it was only reinforced by both the conversation from my fellow presenters, from your questions, Kaid, as well as those that came from the audience. So I found this entire session for me personally uplifting, and now I'm energized to go out there and even do more starting now.
Thank you, Ann Kinzig. Thank you, Jason Vogel, and thank you, Mitch Silver. Ed Salzberg, do you have any closing remarks?
I do. Thank you, Kaid, for moderating an excellent session. Thanks again to Ann, Mitchell, and Jason, and to everyone who stayed on the line right to the end. We really appreciate your attention and those excellent questions that you had submitted. I want to remind you that Island Press is offering a discount on Kaid's book. I think based on this webinar, you can really see the value of his perspective, and you get a 20% discount by sticking in the SSF code. Also, the next two webinars that we have are really important and kind of spin-off of the one that we had today. The one we're doing on November 9th on living flood maps in coastal communities focuses on how to use downscale modeling for site-specific determination of what the flood risk is of individual properties. So if you're a planner and you're in a coastal community, or just a homeowner or a business owner or a real estate agent or an insurance in the insurance industry, what we're going to go over in that session is going to be particularly relevant. And then on Arizona State University series that we're doing on global climate security, the third in the series is coming up on November 18th. And if you just go up to the ssfonline.org website, you'll be able to register for these, and then go into our archives to see what we've done in previous sessions. So again, I want to thank the panelists and the moderator, Kaid. Thanks to Jason, to Ann, and to Mitch. And thanks to Island Press for helping us put this session on. And with that, I'm going to end the session.